Morning, Dr. Michael Fisher, fearologist, philosopher, educator, existentialist, child interested human being that I wonder how the adult world will continue to either address reality for what children are experiencing and youth and or not. It's not my first video on this topic of adults and children and youth, not my first topic on adultism and the problems, on fearism and those problems. But today, what my focus is just to give you a very short insert of a preview, really, of a wonderful film documentary on the work of Ernest Becker. Ernest Becker, I'm just looking for his book here on my shelf, The Denial of Death. Not seeing it right in the moment. 1973 book, Pulitzer Prize winning book on nonfiction. The book published just after he passed away. He was a cultural anthropologist. He was a / historian, philosopher, theorist, thinker of the broad Renaissance type. He could introduce science, humanities, and just the complexity of the anthropology and evolution of human beings and consciousness itself, all within these very fine threads that he was able to knit. You can look up Ernest Becker. I'll give a link to some of that connection with his work. But the video today is really about the film, All Illusions Must Be Broken, and that is actually a quote from Ernest Becker's lectures. And that is what I want to focus on, reading a few quotes from the film, which, because I was a Kickstarter supporter, I got early access to it, and I've been watching it the last few days on my second viewing. And it's a very dense film. Again, probably will come out into public access in the next month or two. But here's a preview of some of the very powerful quotes within it. These were taken from lectures in the 1970s by Ernest Becker when he was at his prime at Berkeley, and thousands of people literally apparently came to his lectures in anthropology and the particular twist that Ernest Becker brought to the human understanding of culture and the upside and the downside. I call him a cultural psychiatrist, and I've named a few others in some earlier talks and some writing I've done. And myself, I'm probably in that same genre as a cultural psychotherapist and or psychiatrist, just for the use of using the term cultural psychiatrist. It's an interesting connection that you think about the psychiatrist and what they do and their job in diagnosing, right? The individual. This is how we've come to know the psychiatrist within the medical paradigm. Now, adding and keeping that medical paradigm, at least the trajectory and history of philosophy and psychology, and the importance of recognizing pathology for what it is and when it is, but also that psychiatry has to be transformed. And that was by the 1970s. And earlier than that, Erich Fromm, the great humanistic psychiatrist and student of Freud who left the Freudian camp, was really also a cultural psychiatrist. Now, with all me going into all those fine details of those folks, you can again look them up and their work. But here, the idea of a cultural psychiatrist is just an interesting one. Where it will go, how useful it will be, how many people will pick up on that. Maybe someday there'll be actually a training to become a cultural psychiatrist. That would be wonderful. Love to see people go into that. I'm too old for that to see probably happen in any university or medical center. But nonetheless, the idea is that anthropology, that is the study of cultures and culture in the largest sense of a sphere of human existence, is a very important category to bring into the field of psychiatry. And health, right? Mental health, so important today. So many people talking about it, including, the great Canadian first wife, minister of Trudeau, and Sophie Gregoire has just published a book, Trudeau, on basically her journey with mental health and advocacy. So I'm reading that as well. You can check that out. Coming Together, I think it's called. But back to the film by Laura Dunn as editor slash director, and her husband partner, Jef Sewell, the director of photography and design. All illusions must be broken. Independent filmmakers. This is, I think, their third or fourth film, and I look forward to seeing some of their earlier films. So without further ado, let me turn now to some of these quotes I want to read. I'm not going to elaborate on them, kind of let them, I'll probably say a few things about maybe a few of the quotes, but let them drift in and think about them is what I'm asking you to imagine. Here is a cultural psychiatrist. Done a lot of work. He's kind of mid-career, just starting to burgeon. Unfortunately, he died too early in life. I think at the age 59, something like that, or earlier. And so it's like, think about these as really drifting notes of warning. Yellow flags for all of us, for humanity. This is the kind of thinker he was. I love that kind of a thinker, the broad and deep and across time and space, looking for universals in the deep psychiatric and the deep psychological levels of existence, but also spiritual, existential. And you'll hear that in Ernest Becker. Now, let me just give those few quotes from the film at the midpoint. I collected some this morning. There's so many wonderful quotes in this film. It's so rich. You have to watch it several times to even begin to gather what was said. But let me pick this particular one to introduce the flavor. And of course, you're going to hear a lot of parallels if you know anything about my work, as very, very similar in where I ended up as a researcher, independent scholar, and have devoted my life to since 1989. Becker is speaking in one of the lectures from recordings. So I've never read this material in his literature, his published works, because I hadn't had contact with his recording. So this documentary film is great for that. Thanks, Laura and Jef, for pulling out that information. Becker says, I think that underneath everything that is at stake in human life is the problem of the terror of this planet. It's a mystical temple and a hall of doom. If you don't see it that way, that is your own defense against seeing it as it is. And to quote, that's why the next section in the film, I noticed after that voiceover of Ernest Becker, the next part of the film was called The Network of Lies. And you can see all illusions must be broken. Lies, illusions, delusions, dissociations. This is the thinking of a deep philosopher, a deep thinker, and yes, someone who thinks like a psychiatrist in what are the lies that we are living, and are we going to be capable of continue to live those lies and have life that can support life on this planet. The way humans are going and the way we are designing things, it isn't going so good. So now I'm going to pull out again from the middle of the film, because there's a child. We see, I think, about 2 or 3 children. They may be children who are related to Laura and Jef, and or they found some child actors, so to speak, or not really actors, but children being photographed very closely by Jef running the camera. And they are continually brought in and out through this video. And I start to think, well, this is a very educational, centered on parenting and socialization of the child. There's not groups of children playing, I don't think, anywhere in the film. It's always the individual child, and usually roaming around in nature. And there's a reason for that, that children have lost a lot of connection with nature, and that leads to a part of this great terror on the planet that children and all humans are living. So now we're talking about the deep unconscious, right? When Becker says, the problem of terror on this planet, I've called it the fear problem on this planet. We're talking the same language. Becker just tended to use terror, and that's fine. It's just the extreme form, if you will, of fear. But this film is particularly, as I am very interested in, if you watch any of my videos on education and children and how to raise children, how I think we ought to think about children. Not that I'm dictating and not that he's dictating how to do that, and that there's one right way. It's not that kind of absolutism or dogmaticism that is in the work. It's much more inspiring than that. It's much more open to the questioning. And so deep questioning, as my deep questioning in my own work about, will we even look at the nature of fear and terror and start to talk about it openly as a society? And I'm talking all human beings, as is Ernest Becker. Let's do these last couple quotes and I'll end the video. Where are you going to get support for your painful self-consciousness? And he asks that of the child. Where are you going to get support for your painful self-consciousness? And of course, you could carry that on and ask that question again to an adult, to a juvenile, to an elder, to someone at the age of dying. Where are you? I love that. And then the next question, how are you going to ask the question of the mystery of yourself? How are you going to explain who you are? Where are you going to get the equanimity to face your own death? If he says, if we looked at psychology and philosophy and thought about the child right from the beginning and the preparation for that child to come onto this earth in this material form, he says, when we thicken up the theory of personality, and he means beyond, very superficial cognitive behavioral ideas of personality or personal psychology or self-psychology. No. Here, get it again. If we thicken up more depth, up the theory of personality from the point of view of existentialism, you understand the early formation of the child as an experience in which a child tries to deny with all their might their anxiety of being in the world, their fear of losing their support, their helplessness, and their ... I couldn't catch the next word. It was too inaudible in the recording. He ends that same quote. The child at a certain age has to explain to themselves the idea that their life is finite and that they are going to die. Sam Keen is high profile in the film. He starts the film off. Sam Keen is a very important psychologist in my life and slash philosopher theologian. He is, again, a very rich thinker of the human condition and an existentialist in many ways, spiritual existentialist in many ways. You can look up Sam Keen's work. He was at the founding of my own forming of the philosophy behind the In Search of Fearlessness project, with the partner I was with at that time, as we began to shape the thinking, the philosophy, the theorizing behind what that project could be on this planet. And that fearlessness movement, what I now call it today for simplicity, is still going. And I have a website on that. And again, you can check that out if you want to find out some of the happenings and the potential mapping of what a fearlessness movement would be on this global planet today and into the future, long after I'm gone. But in Becker asking the question as he interviewed Ernest Becker in 1973, so we have some of these transcripts and even some of these quotes I may have just read come from an interview that Keene had with Becker as well as his lectures at Berkeley. But that when Becker was in the hospital in 1973, in Vancouver, actually, not far, just across the water from me, here I'm on the island, Island, and 1973, Becker was dying of cancer. A very early death and diagnosis. Keene had got the permission and from Psychology Today, and he was one of their major writer editors. And he came up to interview Becker on the deathbed. So this puts this whole gravitas into these quotes, into Becker's work. And this is all done before Becker's book, some months after he died, got nominated and won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, an esteemed, award for any nonfiction writer, a Pulitzer Prize. The importance of that book, The Denial of Death, which is this analysis really of a cultural psychiatrist, as far as I'm concerned. Becker is asked by Laura, who's interviewing him. She's the film director, interviewer. And Sam Keene is pretty old now, 90 probably. And she's asking him, was there any moment where you pushed Ernest Becker in the interview a little further? And Sam Keene says, yes, we had lunch and took a little break. I came back and I thought I really need to be more honest and kind of push Becker and see if I could push him as to why maybe he has, in some sense, perhaps in a new age sense of belief, even though Keene says I don't really believe it, but I needed to ask the question for the magazine interview. He says, Ernest, do you think in some way your view of life about all this terror and dark existential view led to a pretty pessimistic view of humanity at that time? And Keene says, I was really nervous, pushing Becker to talk about that. He's on his deathbed, and I'm sort of saying, well, to him, well, maybe if you wouldn't have been so pessimistic in life, you wouldn't have ended up with cancer, and now you're dying and having to face your death so soon. Keene says he didn't ask the question quite that way, and I don't know exactly how he asked it, but I have Becker's response, which is in the documentary film, to that challenge, and that gets very interesting. So Keene was pushing him to say, weren't you kind of pessimistic? Maybe too pessimistic, and that has led to some negative consequences for your life. Becker does not deny that probably has something to do with his life experience and perhaps even his condition. I don't know exactly how Becker said that, but this is what we do know, which is in the film. And I totally relate to Becker's response as a researcher myself, in the darker side of humanity, we could call it, the more pessimistic side. And Becker says, fair enough for asking that question. When one is doing the work, I'm going to call it the dark work, let's call it of cultural psychiatry. So when one is doing the work, one is always directing that work against prevailing trends. If I stressed in my career the terror, it's only because I just think the world is full of too many cheerful robots. Everyone is talking about the joy, about the good things. And I just feel that in that sense, the critical intellectual has to call attention to what is lacking. And I suppose that gives a one-sidedness, end of quote, to his view and his research and the way he emphasized what was not being emphasized at the time. There were so many books on positive thinking, you're okay, I'm okay, those kinds of books in the 70s and into the 80s. And of course, they're still around today, a massive number of books on what we might call positive psychology. Well, Ernest Becker, as a cultural psychiatrist, as a trained anthropologist who studied the human condition over time and across evolution and animal behavior, as have I studied such wide breadths and depths, not at all of the quality and depth of an Ernest Becker, but along those lines in my own way at my best. And we both end up with that same analysis. Our work goes against the grain of the world, of this particular, in America, in the Americas, in the North anyway. Can't say much about South America because I'm not sure of that cultures. But in the North, and here in Canada, we're so oriented towards this positive thinking view and have been for a long time, perhaps even all of America's history in some way. Some might argue is just a way, but too much trying to be happy and free and not looking at the deeper layers. And same with the children. We want them to be happy. And, they get that message. Oh, you're supposed to be happy. Oh, okay, not okay to be not happy. But children, clearly, when I go to the daycare every once a week, I see them. They're not always happy. But we want to make them happy because then they're quiet and they don't get on our nerves. Amongst a whole lot of other things, they're more conforming to our protocols of an industrial society that wants them to conform and not cause a lot of trouble. It's a lot easier on our workers and who have to take care of our children, including schools. That's why we have these regimes. And of course, Becker's questions, as you can hear if you replay this tape that I just am making now. Becker's questions there, that series of them, are the deep questions, and not just to be read lightly once or twice. And they can be asked of yourself as you view this video. They can be asked of when we deal with children and how we're thinking and imagining what children are experiencing and how they're handling the world. So those are kind of, I think, my main points to raise here. That what I conclude this is I hope to watch more of the video, this documentary. I'll only have access for another day. I'm going to have to go back. I have tons of other notes that I've taken on the first half of the video. And I'm just encouraging people to enter more of this existential layer. I'm not saying all existentialism is the only answer to how to understand children, nor is this terror of one's mortality and the awareness that we are aware we're going to die. That is so important, but it is not the most all important for me as a thinker, as an integral thinker, as a cultural psychiatrist of my own kind. So keep that in mind, and there's a lot of flex here for total joy and happiness, whatever we experience as humans, which are all very real too. But I do think we are in, as he says, a point of the denial of death to the point of our extinction. And that's what any good psychiatrist, psychotherapist, psychologist, counselor, mentor would do. Good teacher, largest sense, would always do, is to help children see that they too can deny the truth the way it is, and thus illusions have to be broken as part of learning. In other words, things we've learned that were useful as defenses, as Becker says. It's defenses constantly that we're defending off this harsh, raw terror experience living on this planet. There's so much truth that, and I'm not going to go on and on about defending the truth of Ernest Becker. You really have to read his many works if you want to make your own opinion about that. Read my works to make your own opinion about that. But let's continue the conversation, is what I always say. And the education of our children, I think, is so important in how we approach this. And let's keep the conversation going. Just right now in town here, connecting with a brand new school, a private school that's opening with this very interesting, model. I'll say more about it probably in another video once I learn more, but I'm connecting with the founders who are just opening it and having good conversations with my director at the daycare center about what is the kind of education we want for children today. But of course, what can we afford? Then there's all the legal complications of fitting in the state, the education system. But the really true independent private school, and they are registered more as homeschoolers right now, in a group of parents that want to get together, but then they're going to use a facility, they're going to use this model of this new kind of, they call it revolutionary education. And so I get very interested, and I'm so lucky that I have at this point in my life to have that conversation with them. And so we're talking real stuff right now. This is not just, off the top. But up until this point, I have not raised, the things either with the daycare I work in, either with this nonprofit, or any of the many other alternative education forms that I've been involved in since way back in the 1980s, when I got involved in the Waldorf School movement and its early roots here in Canada, in Calgary, Alberta. But the conversation is really hard to get to with parents and teachers and administrators of these deeper levels. And this is why Ernest Becker, to me, ought to be at the core of curriculum thinking. Not necessarily exactly in the ways, we don't know exactly how best to deliver that philosophy, and that's this cultural psychiatric understanding, this critical intellectual thinking about how the way it is and how humans are caught in illusion. So all of that I had to just add on the end to think about real education on the ground, as well as visioning education for the future and educational reform and transformation that this planet so needs. Okay. See you later.